I think now, after they kill one Israeli people, we need to kill all the people in Tel and Sarah, even Jit and Farata. Why? Because we don't want it to happen again.
It sounds like you're saying one Jewish life is worth hundreds or thousands of Palestinian lives.
Not million. One Jewish life, it's 10 million, okay?
That just sounds racist.
Yes, I know. I know, but this is the truth. Because God chose us. Because of this, you are jealous. The Bible is the authorizing that this land, it's belong to us, okay?
Israel occupied it militarily.
Yes,
And under international law, that means that no civilian settlements can be built here.
But the God not write in the Bible the international law.
So you're a lawyer,
Yeah,
and you're saying the only law that really counts for you is the Bible.
yeah, of course.
Try to understand a massive, devastating earthquake simply by looking at the collapsed buildings on the surface. You see the rubble, you hear the sirens, and you witness the immediate grief of the survivors. But if you restrict your gaze to the surface, you miss the totality of it. You miss the cause, the origins, the full explanation. To truly comprehend why the ground tore itself apart, you have to look deep underground at the tectonic plates, observing how they have been grinding against each other, building up unfathomable pressure for decades. Trying to understand the deeply complex, incredibly painful headlines coming out of the Middle East today, without understanding Palestine in the year 1948, is exactly like that. You're looking at the rubble, but the underlying mechanisms of the catastrophe remain completely invisible to you. Analyzing current events as an isolated, spontaneous eruption of violence means treating the symptoms without any comprehension of the causes for the disease. Instead, what we are witnessing is the continuation, the echo, and in many ways the terrifying technological escalation of a historical continuum, one that began long before the vast majority of people currently fighting, fleeing, or dying were even born. By opening the archives of the United Nations, human rights investigations, and legal and historical records, we can lay out the facts as they were documented to trace the historical through line of Palestine starting in 1948. We will unpack how tactical choices made in the 1940s evolved from dynamite and forced marches in rural Palestinian villages into artificial intelligence targeting, controlled demolitions, ethnic cleansing invasions, and inconsequential international genocide court battles today. To understand the legal and military landscape of modern war in Gaza, we must step back into the immediate aftermath of World War II, an era when the modern concept of human rights was still in its infancy. The period from the 1920s through the early 1950s witnessed the greatest number of mass forced expulsions and population transfers in modern history. Nations were actively and often violently attempting to engineer ethnically, racially, or nationally homogeneous populations. It was an accepted, albeit brutal, tool of state building at the time. In the early 20th century, before the full impact of Zionist colonization, Palestine was a vibrant Arab society undergoing rapid transitions in education, literacy, and economy. At this time, the Jewish population, largely Sephardic and Mizrahi, lived comfortably alongside Muslims and Christians. As the Zionist movement grew and acquired more land, relations deteriorated into a zero-sum game. Palestinian Arabs watched with trepidation as the Jewish community established separate institutions and excluded Arab labor under the slogan of Hebrew labor. By the 1930s, the Zionist project had built a largely autonomous parastate that was economically larger than the Arab sector. The Jewish militias were not singular arrivals, but were established within Palestine by Zionist settlers, primarily those coming from Central and Eastern Europe. The first militia being founded in 1920 with others in 1931, 1940 and 1941. The last one being an elite commando trained to assist the British during the Second World War. By the time the Israeli state was proclaimed, the paramilitary groups had already successfully carried out a countrywide offensive, expelling approximately 250,000 to 300,000 Palestinians. The massacres and ethnic cleansing that happened in Palestine in 1948 were a localized manifestation of this global operating system of displacement that could only have happened as it did in Palestine with the backing of the winning allies of the Second World War, the UK, France and the USA. Layered on top of this global context was the specific psychological state of the Jewish population. In 1948, those arriving in or living in Palestine felt they stood on the absolute precipice of complete annihilation. Only 3 years had passed since the liberation of the Nazi death camps. The trauma of the Holocaust was not a chapter in a history book. It was a living, breathing nightmare that drove an existential terror. And this trauma of the Holocaust, one would think, would have taught the Jewish settler population in Palestine a lesson or two. This era of industrialized state violence fundamentally altered human language. The word genocide feels ancient, but it is a distinctly modern invention. The term was coined by a Polish Jewish lawyer in 1943 because he realized the English language lacked a word to describe crimes of this magnitude that occurred during the Second World War. By combining the Greek genos, race or tribe, with the Latin said killing, a legal concept was created to describe the intentional destruction of an entire group. The establishment of the State of Israel in the immediate aftermath of this paradigmatic genocide, known as the Holocaust, creates an incredibly complex, highly sensitive backdrop. The displacement or ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people in 1948 is known in Arabic as the Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. UN archives and declassified Israeli military files reveal that this ethnic cleansing displacement was driven by a highly systematic military approach, rather than civilians simply choosing to leave a war zone. Historical records indicate that Zionist and Israeli forces, including the mainstream paramilitary group, as well as right-wing breakaway militias, committed over 30 documented Palestinian massacres during the 1948 war. Some historians suggest the actual number could be over 100, with at least 10 classified as major massacres in military files. These operations reveal how terror was utilized as a tactical tool by the Israelis to spark widespread panic, encouraging other villages to flee before the militias arrived. Carried out primarily by the extremist Israeli paramilitaries, pre-attack planning records show that a majority of Israeli officers voted for the liquidation of the village's men, alongside anyone else who opposed them. Israeli commanders explicitly proposed this liquidation to send a psychological shockwave through the Arab population. Eyewitness recalled watching an entire family of 11 people gunned down while trying to surrender, and documented instances of absolute deranged violence, such as Palestinian villagers being executed with dynamite wedged between them. Located near Hebron, this massacre stands out for its recorded brutality. Testimonies from an Israeli soldier present estimated that between 80 and 100 men, women and children were killed, while Palestinian sources place the figure closer to 300. The Israeli soldier reported seeing Palestinian children's heads broken with sticks and homes blown up, while Palestinian families sheltered inside. When a Belgian UN investigator gained access after initial Israeli military delays, he recorded that the smoldering houses gave off a peculiar sweet smell, the smell of burning bones. The Palestinian village chief later testified that approximately 75 elderly Palestinian residents were executed inside the local mosque, and Palestinian families hidden in nearby caves were lined up and shot with machine guns before their bodies were dumped into a cistern. UN and Red Cross files detail systematic, organized executions of disarmed Palestinians in these northern villages. In Eilabun, local priests documented the precise locations where 13 young Palestinian men were executed against walls and village entrances by Israelis. In Tantura, researchers documented that Israeli troops massacred around 200 Palestinians. Survivors described an assembly line of death where Israeli soldiers brought groups of 10 men to a wall, executed them, dragged the bodies away, and immediately brought the next 10. All these massacres and others, committed by the Jewish people that had just experienced and suffered the Holocaust, as if the lesson learned by them from the Holocaust was to do unto others what had been done unto them. The historical weight of these massacres committed against the Palestinians by the Israelis introduces a highly contested concept, memoricide, or the intentional killing of memory. In the post-Holocaust era, robust documentation mechanisms like the UN made it seemingly impossible to conceal large-scale crimes against humanity like the mentioned massacres. Yet, the dispossessions, ethnic cleansing, and massacres committed on the Palestinians has been systematically marginalized or omitted from Western mainstream history. Memoricide does not require burning every physical document in a filing cabinet. It simply requires ensuring that no one can access, share, or teach those documents without facing severe institutional and professional penalties. This battle over memory is fought directly in academic and legal arenas. When uncovered the Tantura massacre, a veteran organization associated with the Israeli military unit filed a massive libel suit. Palestinian institutions and academics viewed this lawsuit as a chilling warning designed to financially and professionally ruin researchers, thereby deterring any future investigation into historical responsibility for the Nakba. While meticulous reports sit in vaults in Geneva and New York, public memory remains starved of oxygen. If a dominant geopolitical narrative continuously asserts that the Palestinian population left entirely voluntarily, and not because of the massacres and ethnic cleansing, committed by the Jewish and Israeli settlers in post-Second World War Palestine. Fast-forwarding from the rural agrarian Palestinian villages of the 1940s to the densely populated, hyper-modern urban battlefield of Gaza in 2023 and 2024 allows us to analyze how the mechanisms of displacement, ethnic cleansing, genocide have evolved. The catalyst for this recent escalation occurred on October 7, 2023, when Hamas launched a highly coordinated attack into southern Israel, killing 1,200 Israelis and taking approximately 250 hostages into the Gaza Strip, an event that took place against the backdrop of Israel's long-standing, heavily criticized blockade of Gaza. The Israeli military response marked a total paradigm shift in strategy. For 2 decades, Israel's approach to Gaza was colloquially known as mowing the grass, periodic contained aerial bombing campaigns designed to temporarily degrade Hamas militant capabilities before returning to the status quo. In late 2023, Israeli Defense Minister announced a complete siege, stating on camera that there would be no electricity, no food, no water, and no fuel, while justifying this total deprivation by referring to the Palestinians of Gaza as human animals. Legal scholars flag this dehumanizing language as a recognized psychological precursor that lowers the threshold for systemic violence, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. While the tactical goals of the Israeli military forces of 1948 and today remain strikingly similar, the execution has evolved from rudimentary violence into a high-tech, bureaucratic, and industrial-scale operation. Human Rights Watch HRW argues that the modern destruction of life-sustaining infrastructure in Gaza is not merely an unfortunate byproduct of urban warfare. Rather, they contend it represents the intentional creation of conditions calculated by the Israeli military to bring about the physical destruction of the Palestinian population in Gaza, such as engineering epidemics by knocking out water treatment in areas with polluted aquifers. To capture the totality of this modern ethnic cleansing, scholars have adopted specific terms. Ecocide, the systematic scorched earth destruction of the natural environment, including agricultural lands, greenhouses, and ancient olive orchards, rendering the land incapable of sustaining life even if a ceasefire is signed. Scholasticide, the deliberate targeting of a society's, in this case Gaza's, educational architecture. This includes the bombing of all local universities, libraries, and archives, alongside the targeted killing of hundreds of educators and intellectuals. If ecocide destroys the physical hardware of a society, scholasticide deletes its software. It ensures a civilization loses its capacity to rebuild its cultural and professional infrastructure for generations. These academic frameworks translate into absolute horror on the ground. As of June 2026, more than 73,000 Palestinian children, women and men have been killed and more than 173,000 wounded. Given Gaza's confined geography, this casualty volume is historically anomalous for modern conflicts of this duration. The depth of this trauma is encapsulated by a brand new medical acronym coined by doctors in overwhelmed triage wards in Gaza, WCNSF, wounded child, no surviving family. This clinical term describes a Palestinian child pulled from the rubble, physically mangled by explosives whose entire extended bloodline, parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents, has been completely extinguished in a single airstrike. The phenomenon of the WCNSF alongside targeted Israeli military strikes, like the one that destroyed 4,000 IVF embryos at Gaza's largest fertility clinic, represents the physical severing of a people's lineage across current and future generations. Furthermore, history echoes directly in the soil. Just as the UN discovered mass graves in the cisterns of Al-Dawaima in 1948, the UN Human Rights Office in 2024 detailed the recovery of hundreds of bodies from mass graves in the courtyards of the Nasser and Al-Shifa hospital complexes in Gaza. Crucially, reports noted that some victims were found stripped of clothing with their hands bound behind their backs, strongly indicating summary executions that mirror the historical execution styles of Tantura. For the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the 1948 Palestinian refugees currently living in tents, this ancestral trauma is being violently reactualized. Their fear is not just today's bomb. It is the inherited bone-deep terror that once you're forced to leave your land, the international community will never force the occupying power to let you return. While the visceral human experience of terror remains unchanged, no matter it being a stick of dynamite in 1948 or a precision smart bomb today, the modern geopolitical landscape is heavily altered by real-time visibility. Gaza, West Bank, and Lebanon atrocities committed by the Israeli military with the economic and military support of the USA are live-streamed in 4K resolution to smartphones across the globe. Yet human rights groups note a tragic irony. Visibility has not translated into prevention. Instead, it has merely forced the world to watch the repetition of history while debating legal semantics and media misinformation. In 1948, international law was nascent and zero legal accountability followed the Nakba. Today, highly complex proceedings take place at the International Court of Justice, ICJ, against the will of the USA and Israel. In a monumental case brought by South Africa, the ICJ issued a preliminary ruling, finding it plausible that Israel's actions violate the Genocide Convention, ordering provisional measures to prevent genocidal acts. The entire legal architecture hinges on proving dolus specialis or special intent. In international law, a high scale of civilian death alone does not legally constitute genocide. You must prove the perpetrator, in this case the Israeli government, possessed the specific conscious intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. The argument for genocidal intent. Holocaust and genocide scholars argue that combining a complete siege with explicitly dehumanizing rhetoric from high-level officials, such as the human-animal statement, provides direct, documented articulation of dolus specialis. They are stating their intent and executing policies that match it. The counter-argument, other legal experts assert that the legal threshold has not been met. They argue the primary driving intent is the military eradication of Hamas following the October 7th atrocities. Under this interpretation, the leveling of infrastructure and civilian starvation of Palestinians are viewed as the tragic, highly disproportionate consequences of dense urban warfare against an enemy embedded within a civilian population, constituting potential war crimes, but not calculated genocide. This friction is pushing legal boundaries, leading some circles to advocate for expanding the definition to include concepts like genocide by attrition or sociological genocide. These terms describe the slow, systematic destruction of a group's long-term ability to survive on their land by shredding their social fabric rather than relying strictly on rapid, industrialized camp-based slaughter. If these sophisticated international courts exist, why do they struggle so profoundly to enforce accountability and halt the violence? The answer lies in the raw architecture of Israel's geopolitical power, third-party complicity, and Israel's lobbying infrastructure. The scale of operations in Gaza requires continuous logistical, financial, and diplomatic backing from third-party states. The United States serves as the primary focus, rapidly deploying Navy carrier strike groups to the eastern Mediterranean to deter outside regional intervention and secure the perimeter. More importantly, the US, alongside nations like Germany and the United Kingdom, continues to supply the vast majority of the munitions dropped on Gaza, prompting domestic lawsuits against these administrations for failing to meet their legal obligations to prevent genocide. This unwavering support is maintained through a highly organized domestic lobbying infrastructure in the West. Organizations like unpack, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, operate a heavily funded framework designed to achieve specific geopolitical objectives. By utilizing campaign finance mechanisms to bundle millions of dollars for compliant politicians and funding primary challengers against critics, the lobby creates an incredibly powerful gravity field around Capitol Hill. This ensures an unquestioned flow of U.S. military funding and the consistent use of the U.S. veto power at the UN Security Council, effectively shielding state actors from binding legal consequences or international sanctions. This geopolitical umbrella extends directly into the information arena, resulting in what reports term the ethical collapse of Western mainstream media. The information war is fought on two distinct fronts. One, the physical front, an unprecedented death toll for journalists in Gaza, including the killing of over 700 relatives of Palestinian media workers, which organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists assert is a deliberate, targeted strategy to eliminate witnesses by Israel's military. 2. The linguistic front, leaked internal memos from major Western media conglomerates reveal explicit instructions forbidding editors and journalists from using words like genocide, ethnic cleansing, slaughter, or describing Gaza as occupied territory. By controlling the lexicon, institutions control the public's cognitive framework. Forcing the use of passive, neutralizing language sanitizes the catastrophe. When a news anchor reports that dozens died in an explosion at a hospital instead of the Israeli military bombed the hospital, killing dozens, accountability is obscured and public outrage is neutralized. This is the modern bureaucratic implementation of memoricide occurring in real time. When the USA uses its geopolitical leverage to block the UN Security Council and shield Israel from the highest court in the world, it proves that raw power still supersedes legal principle. It exposes the defining existential crisis of our international legal order. International law is incredibly powerful as a normative framework to give humanity the language to name crimes, but as an enforcement mechanism, it remains entirely hostage to the political will of dominant states. The past is not dead, it is not even past. You cannot interpret today's evening news, understand the fury driving global campus protests, or evaluate ICJ rulings without accepting the massacred and murdered Palestinians of 1948. The generational trauma, repeated displacement, ethnic cleansing, and unresolved demands for justice from the Nakba haunt every policy decision and military strike by Israel and the USA happening right now against Palestinians, Arabs and Christians in Gaza, West Bank and Lebanon. Not to mention Iran and Syria. We live in an era of unprecedented real-time documentation, with satellites tracking movements from space and smartphones streaming the rubble of hospitals under a post-Second World War promise of never again. Yet watching the paralyzing power of geopolitical lobbying and the endless debates over legal semantics and media's intentional misinformation forces a set of terrifying final questions. Has Israel, a state that is a consequence of the Holocaust, learned nothing from the racism, ethnic cleansing, suffering and genocide of the Holocaust? Is that never again promise just applicable to the Jewish people and not to the Palestinians or any others? Are the political ambitions of the leaders of Israel and USA more important than the life of hundreds of thousands of children, women and men in the Middle East? On October 7, 2023, a terrorist group massacred innocent men, women and children on Israel's territory and kidnapped, tortured and killed innocent hostages, and for that there is no justification. There should be punishment for those responsible. But what Israel has done to innocent Palestinians in what used to be Palestine, Gaza, the West Bank and in the Middle East, some argue is genocide.
It sounds like you're saying one Jewish life is worth hundreds or thousands of Palestinian lives.
Not million. One Jewish life, it's 10 million, okay?
That just sounds racist.
Yes, I know. But this is the truth. Because God chose us. Because of this, you are jealous.
If you liked this video, found it amusing or in any other way, let others know by giving a like, subscribing, and/or leaving your comment. Thank you.